Marcus Kane moved through the crowded marketplace like a ghost among the living. His weathered face bore the marks of 15 years on the run, and his dark eyes constantly scanned the crowd for danger. The wanted posters bearing his likeness had faded from walls across the kingdom, but the bounty on his head remained as fresh as the day he had escaped from the royal dungeons. The morning sun cast long shadows between the market stalls, and Marcus used each one to his advantage. He had learned long ago that survival meant becoming invisible, blending into the background until he was nothing more than another face in the crowd. His rough hands, once smooth from a life of privilege, now bore the calluses of a man who had learned to live by his wits and his blade. Today was different, though. Today he had come to the capital for a reason that went beyond mere survival. Hidden beneath his worn cloak was a letter that had reached him 3 weeks ago, delivered by a messenger who had risked everything to find him. The letter bore the seal of someone he had thought dead for over a decade, his younger sister, Elena. The message was brief but desperate. Elena was alive, imprisoned in the royal castle, and scheduled for execution in 7 days. She had been accused of treason, just as Marcus had been all those years ago. The same corrupt officials who had framed him were now targeting the last remaining member of his family. The letter contained details that only Elena could know, proving its authenticity and breaking Marcus's heart all over again. As he moved through the market, Marcus remembered the day everything had changed. He had been captain of the royal guard then, trusted by the king himself and respected throughout the kingdom. His crime had been discovering a conspiracy among the king's advisors to sell military secrets to enemy nations. When he had tried to expose them, they had turned the tables, planting evidence that made him appear to be the traitor. The night of his escape had cost him everything: his honor, his position, and what he had believed to be his sister's life. He had been told she died trying to help him flee, cut down by guards in the castle courtyard. For 15 years he had carried that guilt, believing that his quest for justice had killed the only person he truly loved. Now, learning she was alive changed everything. Marcus had spent years avoiding the capital, knowing that returning meant almost certain death. But blood was thicker than caution, and he would not let Elena die for his sins. The plan forming in his mind was desperate and likely suicidal, but it was the only chance he had. He paused at a fruit vendor's stall, pretending to examine apples while his real attention focused on the castle gates visible in the distance. The massive stone structure loomed over the city like a sleeping giant, its towers reaching toward the cloudy sky. Somewhere within those walls, Elena waited for death, probably believing herself abandoned and alone. The castle was heavily guarded, of course. Marcus could see the red uniforms of the royal guard even from this distance, their presence a constant reminder of what he had once been. He knew their routines, their weaknesses, and their strengths better than anyone alive. After all, he had once been their commander, the man who had trained many of them and established the very protocols they now followed. But knowledge and execution were different things entirely. Getting into the castle would require more than just familiarity with guard rotations. It would need perfect timing, incredible luck, and a willingness to sacrifice everything for one chance at redemption. Marcus had all three, along with something even more powerful: nothing left to lose. As he purchased an apple and bit into its sweet flesh, Marcus began to formulate his approach. The execution was set for dawn in 6 days, which meant Elena was likely being held in the castle's eastern tower, where political prisoners were kept before their final march to the gallows. The tower had one major weakness that Marcus doubted anyone else knew about: a drainage tunnel that connected to the old wine cellar, built decades ago and forgotten by everyone except the man who had once been responsible for the castle's security. The guard rotations would be tightest during the day and evening hours, but there was always a brief window just before dawn when shifts changed and attention wavered. If he could time his approach perfectly, he might be able to slip through the outer defenses and reach the drainage tunnel undetected. Of course, getting in was only half the challenge. Getting Elena out alive would be nearly impossible, especially if she was weak from imprisonment. And even if they both managed to escape the castle, the entire kingdom would mobilize to hunt them down. There would be no safe haven, no place to hide from the king's justice. But as Marcus finished his apple and began walking toward the edge of the market, he realized that none of those concerns mattered. He had lived 15 years as a wanted man, always looking over his shoulder, always running from shadows. If Elena died while he did nothing, those shadows would consume him entirely. Better to die trying to save her than to live knowing he had abandoned her to save himself. The sun was beginning to set as Marcus reached the outskirts of the city, where he had hidden his few possessions in an abandoned barn. Tonight he would rest and prepare his equipment. Tomorrow he would begin his reconnaissance of the castle, studying the guards and their patterns with the same intensity he had once brought to protecting the very people who now hunted him. In 6 days, Marcus Kane would either be dead or reunited with his sister. There was no middle ground in the choice he had made, no room for hesitation or second thoughts. The wanted criminal who had once been the kingdom's most trusted defender was about to face his greatest challenge, armed with nothing but determination and the fading hope that justice might finally be served. Captain Thomas Whitmore stood at his post on the castle's eastern wall, watching the sun rise over the kingdom he had sworn to protect. At 35, he was younger than most men who held his rank, but his dedication and skill had earned him the respect of both his superiors and the guards under his command. What they didn't know was that his promotion had come at a terrible cost to his conscience. The morning breeze carried the sounds of the awakening city below, but Thomas's mind was elsewhere, focused on the woman locked in the tower behind him. Elena Kane had been imprisoned for 3 weeks now, accused of corresponding with enemies of the state and plotting against the king. The evidence against her seemed overwhelming. Letters in her handwriting, witness testimony, and even confessions from alleged accomplices. But Thomas had known Elena since childhood. They had grown up in the same district of the capital, their families friends before fate had taken them down different paths. He remembered her as kind and gentle, someone who helped injured animals and shared her food with hungry children. The woman he knew could never commit treason, yet here she was awaiting execution for that very crime. What troubled Thomas most was how familiar this all seemed. 15 years ago, he had been a young guard when Elena's brother, Marcus Kane, had been accused of similar crimes. Thomas remembered looking up to Captain Kane, admiring his honor and dedication. When the accusations surfaced, Thomas had wanted to believe they were false, but the evidence had been undeniable. Or so it had seemed at the time. Now, with Elena facing the same fate, Thomas began to see patterns that disturbed him deeply. The same advisors who had pushed for Marcus's persecution were leading the charge against Elena. The same type of evidence was being presented, and the same rush to judgment was taking place. It was as if history was repeating itself with deadly precision. The night before, Thomas had done something that could cost him his position, possibly his life. He had visited Elena in her cell, ostensibly to check on the prisoner's condition, but actually to look into her eyes and judge for himself whether she was capable of treason. What he found there was not guilt or defiance, but a quiet dignity that reminded him powerfully of her brother. Elena had recognized him immediately, despite the years that had passed since their childhood friendship. She had smiled sadly and asked about his family, his career, his happiness, everything except her own dire situation. When he finally asked her directly about the charges, her response had shaken him to his core. "Thomas," she had said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I am guilty of only one crime, being Marcus Kane's sister. Everything else is lies built upon lies, just as they were with him." The certainty in her voice, the lack of desperation or pleading, had convinced Thomas that she was telling the truth. But knowing the truth and acting on it were different things entirely. He was one man in a system that had already decided Elena's fate. Speaking out would only result in his own destruction while changing nothing for her. As Thomas continued his patrol, he noticed unusual activity in the courtyard below. Additional guards were being posted at key positions and supplies were being moved with more urgency than normal. When he inquired about the changes, his lieutenant explained that intelligence had suggested Marcus Kane might attempt to rescue his sister. The news hit Thomas like a physical blow. If Marcus was indeed planning a rescue attempt, it would be suicide. The castle's defenses had been strengthened significantly since his escape 15 years ago, and every entrance was now heavily monitored. Even if Marcus possessed detailed knowledge of the castle's layout, the sheer number of guards would make penetration impossible. But as the day progressed, Thomas found himself thinking not about the impossibility of Marcus's mission, but about the desperation that must be driving him. A man who had lived as a fugitive for 15 years wouldn't risk everything unless he had no other choice. The fact that Marcus was willing to attempt such a hopeless rescue only reinforced Thomas's growing belief that both Kane siblings were innocent. By midday, Thomas had reached a decision that would change his life forever. He couldn't save Elena through official channels. The corruption that had destroyed her brother ran too deep for that. But he could ensure that if Marcus did attempt a rescue, he would have a fighting chance of success. Thomas began by studying the guard rotations more carefully than he ever had before. He identified the weak points in the defenses, the times when attention might be focused elsewhere, and the routes that would offer the best chance of avoiding detection. He wasn't actively helping a wanted criminal, not yet, but he was preparing himself to make that choice if the moment came. The ethical weight of his decision pressed down on him like a physical burden. He had spent his entire adult life serving the crown, believing in the system and the justice it represented. To abandon that now felt like betraying everything he had built his identity around. But the alternative was watching an innocent woman die while her brother threw his life away in a doomed rescue attempt. As evening approached, Thomas made his rounds through the castle with new eyes. He saw not just the defenses that protected the royal family, but also the prison that held Elena Kane. Every guard he passed, every protocol he followed, every order he gave was now filtered through the knowledge that he might soon be working against everything he had sworn to protect. The irony was not lost on him. Marcus Kane had once been where Thomas now stood, a loyal captain faced with evidence of corruption in the system he served. Marcus had chosen to act on his conscience, and it had cost him everything. Now Thomas faced the same choice, knowing full well what the consequences might be. But there was one crucial difference between their situations. Marcus had tried to work within the system, trusting that truth and justice would prevail through proper channels. Thomas had already seen how that approach had failed twice. If he was going to act, it would have to be outside the system entirely. As night fell over the castle, Thomas stood once again on the eastern wall, but now his vigil had a different purpose. He was no longer just guarding the castle against potential threats. He was watching for a specific threat, one that he hoped would come soon enough to matter. Somewhere out there in the darkness, Marcus Kane was planning what everyone assumed would be a suicide mission. Thomas had the power to ensure that it wasn't, but using that power would make him a traitor to his oath and his position. The weight of that choice settled over him like a heavy cloak, but beneath the burden was something he hadn't felt in years, the clear knowledge that he was about to do the right thing, regardless of the cost. Tomorrow night, if Marcus Kane appeared at the castle walls, he would find unexpected assistance from someone who had once looked up to him as a hero, and now understood why that admiration had been justified all along. The clock tower chimed midnight as Marcus emerged from the shadows at the base of the castle's outer wall. He had spent 3 days observing the guard patterns, mapping every rotation and identifying the brief windows of opportunity that might allow him passage. Tonight was Elena's last night alive, and this was his only chance to save her. Marcus pressed himself against the cold stone wall, feeling the familiar weight of his sword at his side and the coil of rope across his back. His dark clothing helped him blend into the shadows, but he knew that stealth would only carry him so far. Once inside the castle proper, he would be relying on speed, surprise, and 15 years of desperation. The drainage tunnel, he remembered, was exactly where it should be, hidden behind a tangle of ivy that had grown wild over the years. The iron grate that covered the opening was rusted but still solid, requiring precious minutes of careful work with a small crowbar to pry it loose. Every scrape of metal against metal seemed impossibly loud in the quiet night, but no alarm was raised. The tunnel was smaller than Marcus remembered, forcing him to crawl on his hands and knees through the narrow passage. The stagnant water that pooled in the low spots soaked through his clothes, and the smell of decay and forgotten years filled his nostrils. But the route was unguarded just as he had hoped, and after what felt like an eternity, he emerged into the old wine cellar beneath the castle's main keep. The cellar was exactly as he remembered it, filled with dusty bottles and ancient barrels that had been forgotten by successive generations of castle staff. More importantly, it was empty of guards. The door leading to the main castle was heavy oak, reinforced with iron bands, but Marcus still had the key he had never returned when he fled 15 years ago. The key turned smoothly in the well-oiled lock, and Marcus found himself in the castle's lower corridors for the first time since his escape. The familiar stone walls and arched ceilings brought back a flood of memories, both good and bad. This had once been his home, the place where he had been respected and trusted. Now it felt like the belly of a beast that was trying to digest him. Marcus moved through the corridors with the confidence of someone who knew every stone and shadow. The guard rotations in the lower levels were predictable, and he was able to avoid the patrols by timing his movements precisely. His destination was the Eastern Tower, 3 floors above and through some of the most heavily defended areas of the castle. The first real challenge came at the main staircase leading to the upper levels. 2 guards were posted there permanently, and there was no way to avoid them. Marcus waited in an alcove, watching their movements and looking for any sign of inattention. When one guard stepped away to light a torch that had gone out, Marcus moved. He struck silently and efficiently, using pressure points he had learned years ago to render both guards unconscious without killing them. These men were just doing their duty, and Marcus had no desire to shed innocent blood. He dragged their bodies into a storage room and barred the door from the outside, buying himself time before they were discovered. The upper levels of the castle were more dangerous, with more guards and fewer places to hide. But Marcus's knowledge of the building served him well, and he was able to use servants' passages and forgotten corridors to avoid the main routes. Twice he had to hide in darkened doorways while patrols passed, his heart pounding so loudly he was certain they would hear it. As he approached the Eastern Tower, Marcus began to sense that something was different about the guard arrangements. The patterns he had observed from outside didn't match what he was seeing now. Guards who should have been at their posts were absent, while others seemed to be looking in the wrong directions at crucial moments. It was too convenient to be coincidence, but Marcus couldn't afford to question his good fortune. Elena was somewhere above him, and dawn was only hours away. Whether his luck was natural or assisted, he had to take advantage of it while he could. The tower staircase was the most dangerous part of his journey. It was narrow, with no alternate routes and nowhere to hide if he encountered guards. Marcus climbed slowly, testing each stone step for creaks or loose masonry that might betray his presence. The sword at his side felt heavier with each step, a reminder that his luck might not hold forever. On the 3rd floor of the tower, Marcus found what he was looking for, a heavily reinforced door with 2 guards posted outside. But as he watched from the shadows, both guards suddenly left their posts, called away by a messenger who claimed their captain needed them immediately. Within moments, the corridor was empty except for Marcus and the door that separated him from his sister. The lock on Elena's cell was more sophisticated than the simple mechanism in the wine cellar, but Marcus had come prepared. The picks he carried were tools of his fugitive trade, and the lock yielded to his patient manipulation after several tense minutes. When the door swung open, he found himself face to face with the woman he had thought dead for 15 years. Elena was thinner than he remembered, and her dark hair was streaked with premature gray, but her eyes were the same ones that had watched him leave for his military service so many years ago. For a moment, neither sibling could speak, overwhelmed by the impossibility of their reunion. "Marcus," Elena whispered finally, tears streaming down her face. "I knew you would come. I never stopped believing you would find a way." "We have to go," Marcus replied, his voice thick with emotion. "Dawn is coming and the guards will be back soon." Elena nodded and rose from the straw pallet that had served as her bed. She was weaker than she tried to show, and Marcus could see that the weeks of imprisonment had taken their toll. But her spirit was unbroken, and when she took his offered arm, her grip was steady and determined. As they stepped into the corridor, Marcus heard the sound that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The echo of running footsteps on stone stairs getting closer with each heartbeat. Someone had discovered his presence in the castle, and the guards were coming. The escape route he had planned was no longer viable. The lower levels would be swarming with searchers within minutes, and the drainage tunnel would be the first place they looked once they realized how he had entered. Marcus's mind raced through alternatives, but every option seemed to lead to the same conclusion. They were trapped. But as the sound of approaching guards grew louder, Marcus made a decision that surprised even him. Instead of trying to flee, he drew his sword and positioned himself between Elena and the staircase. If they couldn't escape, at least he could ensure that Elena didn't die alone and forgotten in a castle cell. They would face their fate together, as brother and sister should. The footsteps reached their floor, and Marcus could see torchlight flickering on the walls. In moments, the guards would round the corner and see them. Elena pressed close behind him, and he could feel her trembling, not with fear, but with the same determination that had sustained him through 15 years of exile. "Whatever happens," Marcus whispered to her, "know that I never stopped trying to come home to you." The first guard appeared at the top of the stairs, and Marcus raised his sword. The final act of his long journey was about to begin. The guard who appeared at the top of the stairs was not who Marcus expected to see. Instead of the faceless soldiers he had been avoiding all night, he found himself staring at a man he recognized from his past, Thomas Whitmore, now wearing the insignia of a captain but still possessing the earnest face Marcus remembered from years ago. "Captain Kane," Thomas said quietly, his sword remaining in its sheath despite the wanted criminal standing before him. "I was wondering when you would arrive." Marcus kept his weapon raised, unsure whether he was facing an enemy or something else entirely. Behind him, Elena gasped in recognition, remembering the boy who had once played in her family's garden during happier times. "Thomas?" Elena whispered. "You're the one who has been adjusting guard schedules and creating convenient absences." Thomas finished for her. "Yes, though I'm not sure it will matter much now." The sound of more footsteps echoed from the stairwell below, and Thomas's expression grew urgent. "There are at least 20 guards coming up those stairs, Marcus. Some of them are good men who are just following orders, but others—" He paused, his jaw tightening. "Others have been looking forward to collecting the bounty on your head." Marcus lowered his sword slightly but didn't sheath it. "Why are you helping us?" "Because I've seen this same play performed twice now and I finally understand who the real villains are," Thomas replied. "Your sister is innocent, just as you were innocent 15 years ago. The same corrupt officials who destroyed your life are now trying to finish the job by killing the only family you have left." The footsteps were getting closer, and Thomas moved with sudden decisiveness. He stepped aside and gestured toward a corridor that Marcus hadn't noticed before. "There's a passage here that leads to the chapel's bell tower. From there you can reach the outer walls, but you'll need to move quickly." "What about you?" Elena asked, reaching out to touch the arm of their unexpected ally. Thomas smiled grimly. "I'm going to do what your brother should have been able to do 15 years ago. Tell the truth. Consequences be damned." Before Marcus could respond, the first of the pursuing guards burst onto the tower level. Thomas immediately stepped between them and the Kane siblings, his own sword now drawn. "Captain Whitmore," the lead guard called out. "Have you found the prisoners?" "They're not here," Thomas replied smoothly. "But I heard sounds from the floor above. Quickly, we need to check the roof access." Some of the guards bought the deception and continued up the stairs, but others remained skeptical. Marcus could see doubt and suspicion in their faces, and he knew that Thomas's cover wouldn't hold for long. "Go," Thomas urged quietly, not turning around. "The passage leads down and around to the chapel's exterior wall. There's a drain pipe you can use to reach the ground, but once you're there, you'll be in the main courtyard." Marcus hesitated. Leaving Thomas to face the consequences alone felt like abandoning another innocent person to the same corrupt system that had destroyed so many lives. But Elena was growing weaker, and every second of delay reduced their chances of escape. "I won't forget this," Marcus told Thomas, gripping the younger man's shoulder briefly. "Just get your sister to safety," Thomas replied. "That's all the thanks I need." Marcus guided Elena into the narrow passage, supporting her weight as they moved through the cramped space. Behind them, he could hear Thomas continuing to misdirect the guards, but voices were beginning to rise in suspicion and anger. The passage was even more challenging than the drainage tunnel had been, requiring them to crawl through sections barely wide enough for their shoulders. Elena's breathing became labored, and Marcus realized that weeks of imprisonment had weakened her more than she had admitted. Twice she stumbled, and he had to catch her before she fell. When they finally emerged from the passage, they found themselves in the chapel's bell tower, high above the castle's main courtyard. The view was breathtaking and terrifying. They could see the entire castle spread out below them, with guards already beginning to organize search parties in response to the alarm that had finally been raised. The drain pipe Thomas had mentioned was there, but it was ancient and looked barely capable of supporting one person's weight, let alone two. Marcus tested it carefully, trying to determine if it would hold them both during the descent. I can't make it down that, Elena said, reading his thoughts. I'm too weak and I'll only slow you down. We go together or not at all, Marcus replied firmly. I didn't spend 15 years planning this rescue just to leave you behind at the end. Then we need another way, Elena said, looking around the small bell tower chamber. What about the bell rope? Marcus followed her gaze and saw the thick rope that operated the chapel's bronze bell. It was much stronger than the drain pipe and descended directly into the chapel itself, which would provide some concealment. But using it would require them to ring the bell, alerting everyone in the castle to their location. Sometimes the best hiding place is in plain sight, Marcus muttered, making his decision. He helped Elena position herself on the rope, then grasped it himself just as the bell tower door burst open behind them. 3 guards rushed in, swords drawn, but Marcus and Elena were already dropping into the darkness below. The bell tolled once, twice, 3 times as their combined weight pulled on the rope. The bronze voice echoed across the castle and the surrounding city, a funeral knell that seemed to mark the end of their desperate flight. But as they descended through the chapel's shadowy interior, Marcus realized that the bell might actually be helping them. Throughout the castle, guards would be rushing toward the source of the sound, assuming that the fugitives were in or near the bell tower. By the time they realized their mistake, Marcus and Elena might be able to reach the outer walls. They landed hard on the chapel floor, Elena crying out softly as her weakened legs buckled beneath her. Marcus caught her and helped her to cover behind one of the large stone pillars that supported the chapel's vaulted ceiling. Outside they could hear shouting voices and running feet as guards converged on their presumed location. The chapel's main doors were too risky. They opened directly onto the courtyard where most of the search activity was concentrated, but Marcus remembered a small side entrance that led to the castle's herb garden, which was adjacent to the outer wall. If they could reach it undetected, they might still have a chance. As they moved carefully through the chapel's shadows, Marcus caught sight of movement in the main courtyard through one of the stained glass windows. In the torchlight he could see Thomas being escorted by armed guards, his hands bound behind his back. The young captain's head was held high, and even from a distance, Marcus could see that he showed no signs of regret for his choice. He sacrificed everything for us, Elena whispered, following Marcus's gaze. Then we make sure his sacrifice means something, Marcus replied. They reached the side door without being detected, but as Marcus eased it open, he saw guards patrolling the herb garden beyond. The outer wall was visible just 50 yards away, but the open ground between them and safety was well illuminated by torches and actively patrolled. Marcus studied the patrol patterns, looking for any gap in the coverage that might allow them passage, but as he watched, more guards appeared and the gaps in their coverage began to close. Someone, probably the castle's current security commander, had anticipated that fugitives might try to use the herb garden as an escape route. There are too many of them, Elena said, seeing the same thing Marcus was seeing. Marcus was about to agree when the sound of steel against steel rang out across the courtyard. Somewhere in the castle a fight had broken out, possibly other prisoners trying to take advantage of the chaos, or perhaps Thomas making one final stand against his captors. Whatever the cause, the distraction drew several guards away from the herb garden, creating the opening Marcus had been waiting for. He squeezed Elena's hand and whispered, "Now or never." They slipped through the door and began their final dash toward the outer wall, knowing that discovery now would mean certain death for both of them. Behind them, the sounds of conflict continued to echo through the castle courtyard, and Marcus found himself hoping that Thomas was still alive to see the sunrise that Elena would now live to witness. The dash across the herb garden felt like an eternity compressed into heartbeats. Marcus half-carried Elena as they weaved between the neat rows of medicinal plants, using every shadow and every moment of distraction to stay invisible to the guards. The outer wall loomed ahead of them, 15 feet of stone that represented the boundary between captivity and freedom. Marcus had thrown a grappling hook over the wall and was helping Elena begin her climb when the inevitable happened. A guard's torch swept across their position, and their escape was discovered. There, by the wall! The shout cut through the night like a blade, and suddenly the herb garden exploded into activity. Guards converged from multiple directions, their torches creating a web of moving light that eliminated any remaining shadows. Marcus boosted Elena higher up the rope, shouting for her to keep climbing no matter what happened below. "I won't leave you," Elena called down, but Marcus was already drawing his sword to face the approaching guards. "You have to," he replied. "Someone needs to survive to tell the truth about what happened here." The first guard reached Marcus just as Elena pulled herself over the top of the wall. Marcus's blade met the guard's sword in a clash of steel that sent sparks flying in the torchlight. 15 years of living as a fugitive had kept Marcus's skills sharp, and he fought with the desperation of a man who had nothing left to lose. But skill and desperation could only carry him so far against overwhelming numbers. More guards appeared with each passing second, surrounding him in a tightening circle of steel and torchlight. Marcus fought brilliantly, his sword work reminding everyone present why he had once been considered the finest swordsman in the kingdom. But the outcome was inevitable. A blade slipped past his defense, opening a cut on his left arm. Another found its mark on his shoulder, and Marcus stumbled, his strength beginning to fade. The guards sensed victory and pressed their advantage, driving him back against the very wall that Elena had just climbed. Above him, Marcus could hear Elena calling his name, but he didn't dare look up to see if she had successfully reached the other side. All of his attention was focused on the deadly dance of swords that surrounded him, each parry and riposte potentially his last. Then from the direction of the main castle came a sound that changed everything, the distinctive crack of a crossbow being fired, followed immediately by the whistle of a bolt cutting through the air. One of the guards facing Marcus suddenly staggered, a crossbow bolt protruding from his back, and fell to his knees. The other guards turned in confusion, trying to identify this new threat, and Marcus seized the moment of distraction to slash his way out of their circle. But instead of more crossbow fire, what followed was something far more ominous: the unmistakable roar of a primitive firearm. The explosion of gunpowder echoed off the castle walls like thunder, and Marcus saw a flash of fire and smoke from an upper window of the main keep. One of the guards nearest to him spun around and collapsed, clutching his chest where the musket ball had found its mark. "Gunfire!" someone screamed. "They have guns!" The herb garden descended into chaos. Guards who had been focused on capturing Marcus now scattered for cover, unsure where the next shot might come from. Some ran toward the castle, others pressed themselves against the wall, and still others simply fled in panic. Marcus used the confusion to his advantage, striking down 2 more guards before they could recover from their shock. But he was still outnumbered, still wounded and still trapped against the wall. The gunfire had bought him precious seconds, but it hadn't fundamentally changed his situation. Then he saw who was responsible for the unexpected rescue attempt. Thomas Whitmore appeared in the garden, no longer bound but carrying a smoking musket and a crossbow. His uniform was torn and bloodied, suggesting he had fought his way out of whatever captivity had been intended for him. "The rope!" Thomas shouted to Marcus, gesturing toward the grappling hook that still hung from the wall. But as Thomas raised his crossbow to provide covering fire, more guards poured into the garden from the main courtyard. These were not the confused, frightened men who had scattered at the sound of gunfire. These were the castle's elite guards, trained to face any threat without flinching. Marcus realized with sinking heart that Thomas's rescue attempt, brave as it was, had probably doomed them both. The young captain was outnumbered at least 10 to 1, and his weapons, while effective, couldn't be reloaded quickly enough to deal with so many opponents. "You should have stayed hidden," Marcus called to Thomas as they found themselves fighting back-to-back against the advancing guards. "I told you, I'm done watching good people die for other men's crimes," Thomas replied, parrying a sword thrust with his empty musket before drawing his own blade. The fighting became fierce and desperate. Marcus and Thomas were both skilled warriors, but they were facing the kingdom's finest soldiers in conditions that heavily favored their opponents. The herb garden's neat rows became a battlefield littered with the wounded and the fallen. Marcus felt his strength ebbing with each exchange of blows. The wounds he had sustained were taking their toll, and his movements were becoming slower and less precise. Beside him, Thomas was breathing heavily, blood streaming from a cut on his forehead that obscured his vision. It was then that Marcus heard Elena's voice from beyond the wall, not calling for him to escape, but shouting at someone else, "Help them. Please, you have to help them." The response came in the form of more gunfire, not from within the castle, but from beyond the walls. Elena had somehow found allies in the city. and they were now joining the fight with weapons that the castle guards were unprepared to face. Musket balls began striking the herb garden from outside the walls, forcing the castle guards to take cover behind stone planters and tool sheds. The sound was deafening, crack after crack of gunpowder explosions that seemed to shake the very foundations of the ancient castle. Marcus couldn't see who was providing this unexpected support, but their timing was perfect. The guards who had been pressing their attack suddenly found themselves caught between the swords of their original targets and the firearms of unknown enemies beyond the wall. "The city watch," Thomas gasped, understanding what was happening before Marcus did. Elena must have reached Captain Morrison. He's one of the few honest officials left in the kingdom. The battle in the herb garden became a three-way conflict, with castle guards trying to fight on multiple fronts while Marcus and Thomas pressed their advantage. But the gunfire from beyond the walls was beginning to slacken. Either the shooters were running low on ammunition, or the castle's archers had found positions from which to return fire. Marcus knew they had only moments before the tide turned against them again. The rope still hung from the wall, tantalizingly close but guarded by at least 6 men who had taken cover near its base. Getting to it would require running directly into their weapons. "We'll never make it," Thomas said, following Marcus's gaze. "Maybe we don't have to," Marcus replied, pulling a small leather pouch from his belt. "Remember how we used to clear blocked passages in the old siege tunnels?" Thomas's eyes widened as he recognized the makeshift explosive Marcus was preparing. "That's going to bring down half the wall." "Better than dying in a herb garden," Marcus said grimly. He lit the fuse with a torch that had fallen during the fighting, then hurled the small bomb toward the section of wall where their enemies had taken cover. The explosion that followed was tremendous, sending stone fragments flying in all directions and creating a cloud of dust and debris that obscured everything. When the dust settled, a jagged hole had been blown in the outer wall, wide enough for several men to pass through at once. Beyond it, Marcus could see figures in the uniforms of the city watch, led by a grizzled captain he recognized as Morrison, one of the few men who had believed in his innocence 15 years ago. "Marcus Kane," Morrison called out. "This way, quickly!" But as Marcus and Thomas stumbled toward the breach in the wall, the castle's defenders launched one final desperate attack. Guards poured into the herb garden from every entrance, determined to prevent the escape of the kingdom's most wanted fugitive. The fighting became brutal and chaotic. Marcus found himself separated from Thomas, each man battling for his life against multiple opponents. The sound of gunfire continued to echo across the courtyard as the city watch tried to provide covering fire, but the smoke and dust made it impossible for them to distinguish friend from foe. Marcus was almost to the breach when a sword blade caught him across the ribs, sending him stumbling to his knees. The guard responsible raised his weapon for a killing blow, but Thomas appeared behind him, driving his own blade between the man's shoulders. "Go," Thomas shouted, hauling Marcus to his feet. "I'll hold them here." "Not without you," Marcus replied, but even as he spoke, more guards were appearing, and he could see that Thomas was already surrounded. The young captain smiled sadly, the same expression Marcus remembered from their earlier conversation in the tower. "Tell Elena I kept my promise," he said, then turned to face the advancing guards with his sword raised. Marcus had no choice but to run. He stumbled through the breach in the wall, supported by Morrison's men, as the sounds of battle continued behind him. The gunfire echoed through the courtyard one final time, a thunder. 3 months after the escape from the castle, Marcus Kane stood in a small cottage on the outskirts of a farming village 200 miles from the capital. His wounds had healed, leaving only scars to remind him of that terrible night, but the emotional wounds remained fresh and painful. Elena was recovering her strength slowly, the weeks of imprisonment having taken a toll that rest and good food were only beginning to repair. The cottage belonged to Captain Morrison, who had quietly retired from the city watch after helping with their escape. The official story was that he had grown tired of city life and wanted to spend his remaining years in peaceful surroundings. The truth was that his assistance to the Kane siblings had made his position in the capital untenable. "Any word from the capital?" Elena asked as Marcus returned from his daily walk to the village market. Marcus shook his head. "Morrison's contacts have gone quiet. Whatever's happening there, they're not willing to risk sending messages." It had been this way for weeks. In the immediate aftermath of their escape, news had traveled quickly through underground channels. Thomas Whitmore had died fighting in the herb garden, just as Marcus had feared. The official report claimed he had been killed while trying to prevent the escape of dangerous criminals. But those who knew the truth understood that he had died a hero. The corrupt officials who had orchestrated the Kane family's persecution had moved quickly to contain the damage. Elena's execution had been postponed indefinitely while investigations were conducted. But Marcus knew this was merely a delay tactic. As long as Elena remained free, she was living proof that the kingdom's justice system had failed. What troubled Marcus most was the silence from potential allies. He had expected that Thomas's sacrifice might inspire others to speak out, that the dramatic escape might draw attention to the corruption that had destroyed so many lives. Instead, the kingdom seemed to have closed ranks, presenting a united front that painted the Kane siblings as dangerous fugitives who had corrupted a loyal guard. "Do you think we did the right thing?" Elena asked one evening as they sat by the cottage's small fireplace. "Thomas died because of us. Morrison lost everything he worked for. How many other people will suffer because we refuse to accept our fate?" Marcus had wrestled with the same questions every day since their escape. The pragmatic answer was that staying hidden was the only way to protect the people who had helped them. But the former captain in him rebelled against the idea of allowing corruption to flourish unchallenged. "Thomas made his own choice," Marcus replied finally. "He could have let us die and continued living his comfortable lie. Instead, he chose to act on his conscience knowing what it would cost him. But was it worth it?" Elena pressed. "What have we accomplished except creating more tragedy?" Before Marcus could answer, Morrison appeared in the doorway of the cottage. The former captain's face was grim, and he carried a leather satchel that he set down on the table with obvious reluctance. "News from the capital," Morrison said without preamble. "It's not what we hoped for." He opened the satchel and withdrew several documents, official proclamations, wanted posters, and what appeared to be witness statements. Marcus's heart sank as he saw the familiar pattern of manufactured evidence that had destroyed his life 15 years earlier. "They're claiming Thomas was part of a conspiracy," Morrison explained. "According to the official story, he was secretly working with you from the beginning, feeding you information and planning the entire rescue operation. His death is being portrayed as the natural consequence of his betrayal." Elena put her hand to her mouth in horror. "They're destroying his memory just like they destroyed Marcus's reputation." "It gets worse," Morrison continued. "They've arrested 3 other guards who served under Thomas, claiming they were also part of the conspiracy. 2 of them are already dead, supposedly killed while resisting arrest." Marcus felt a familiar rage building in his chest, the same fury that had sustained him through 15 years of exile. The corrupt system wasn't content with merely defeating its enemies. It had to destroy them completely, erasing any possibility that their sacrifice might inspire others. "There's one more thing," Morrison said, pulling out a final document. This arrived yesterday through the same channels that brought the other news. The document was a private letter, written in a hand that Marcus didn't recognize but bearing a seal that made his blood run cold. It was the personal seal of Lord Aldrich, the king's chief advisor and the man Marcus suspected of orchestrating the entire conspiracy. The letter was brief and to the point. "Your continued existence is an embarrassment to the crown and a danger to the kingdom's stability. Surrender yourselves within 1 month and your deaths will be quick and private. Continue to hide and we will ensure that everyone who has helped you shares your fate. Choose wisely." The cottage fell silent as the implications of the threat sank in. Morrison, his contacts in the capital, the village that had unknowingly sheltered them, all were now at risk because of Marcus and Elena's refusal to die quietly. "He's not bluffing," Morrison said quietly. "Aldrich has the resources and the ruthlessness to carry out this threat. If you don't surrender, innocent people will suffer." Marcus stared at the letter, feeling the weight of impossible choices pressing down on him once again. Every option led to tragedy. Surrender meant death for him and Elena, but continued resistance meant death for others. "There might be another way," Elena said suddenly, her voice quiet but determined. Both men looked at her, and Marcus saw something in his sister's eyes that reminded him of their father. A steely resolve that had once made Lord Kane one of the kingdom's most respected nobles. "What if we stopped running?" Elena continued. "What if we went back to the capital but not to surrender?" "Elena, that's suicide," Marcus protested. "Is it?" she replied. We've been thinking like fugitives trying to hide from a system that wants us dead. But what if we started thinking like the people we used to be? Nobles who had a right to demand justice. Morrison leaned forward, intrigued despite himself. What are you suggesting? Elena stood and walked to the window, looking out at the peaceful village that might soon be under threat because of their presence there. I'm suggesting we stop letting them control the narrative. Thomas died trying to expose the truth, but his sacrifice was wasted because no one heard his story. What if we made sure the entire kingdom heard it? Marcus felt a spark of the old hope that had once driven him to fight corruption from within the system. But this time the fight wouldn't be from within. It would be a direct challenge to the very foundations of the kingdom's power structure. You're talking about open rebellion, Morrison said. I'm talking about justice, Elena replied. Real justice, not the corrupt mockery that sentenced us to death for crimes we didn't commit. As the three conspirators began to plan their return to the capital, none of them spoke about the obvious truth, that they were almost certainly planning their own deaths. But sometimes, Marcus reflected, the manner of one's death mattered more than the fact of it. Thomas Whitmore had understood that, and perhaps it was time for the Kane siblings to honor his memory by following his example. The gunfire that had echoed through the castle courtyard 3 months ago had been an ending of sorts. But as they prepared to return to the scene of their desperate escape, Marcus began to hope that it might also prove to have been a beginning.